As you wake, you're not quite sure where you are. You can faintly hear the sound of crickets. A cabin, perhaps. It's dark, and the only thing illuminated is the table at which you're sitting. Across the table, an old man slowly comes into view. Another challenger. It has been ages. Perhaps you've forgotten how this game is played. Allow me to remind you. You're then made to play the man's game, traversing the forest, the marsh, the snow line, to some unknown destination. And if you fail at any point along the way, well, you die. But no matter, as another will soon take your place at the table, all until the destination is reached and the final challenge overcome. And even then, it may not be the end. As you play Leshy's game, one of the cards you start with reveals itself to be unlike the others. It can talk, and it wants help to break this cycle. Leshy doesn't mind you getting up from the table, saying it lets you stretch your legs while he plans your future encounters. So, at the Stoat's advice, you peruse your surroundings, solving puzzles to both aid your progress in the game and to escape this accursed cabin. Inscryption is an indie roguelike which came out in 2021 and was well received both critically and by fans of the game. Personally, it's one of my favorites to have come out in the past couple years. However, rather than reviewing the game, I wanted to take an opportunity to see what lessons can be learned from a development standpoint. See, my channel has its roots from when I was trying to develop my own game, and during that time I started looking at other popular indie games I could possibly pull lessons from. Although I'm not developing my own game anymore, I do still enjoy analyzing how games flow and feel, as well as talking about the reasoning why or why not you might want to include certain features in your own project. So, let's take a walk in the woods to see what we can learn. Inscryption's origins come from years earlier. Dan Mullins, the game's designer, created the game's precursor as part of Ludum Dare 43 in 2018. Sacrifices Must Be Made was named after the theme of the game jam that year. Sacrifices must be made. Mullins had recently gotten back into Magic the Gathering, so when the theme was revealed, he thought of the game's sacrificing mechanics and envisioned a card game revolving around that idea. To take it one step further, he thought about further sacrifice as a mechanic. Perhaps you could cut out an eye or cut off a hand to gain an edge while playing, to quite literally tip the scales. Mullins had just finished his previous large-scale project, The Hex, just before the game jam, and with that was looking into what his next large project would be. Although it was made fairly quickly, Sacrifices was the most well-received game for a game jam Mullins had created up to that point. He figured he was onto something. Thus, with the turn of the new year into 2019, development of Inscryption started in earnest. And this is where we're going to get into our first lesson. Keep it simple, stupid. This may sound like common sense, but don't spend 7 months trying to make something way above your head. Trust me, I tried, and I failed. Sacrifices Must Be Made is very simple mechanically. You have cards, and each card has a cost. Sacrifice weak creatures to play stronger creatures, and hit your opponent until you have victory. Some cards have special rules, but none are too far out there. And the difference between Sacrifices and Inscryption is almost entirely in polish, scope, and story. Sacrifices was meant to be played once, maybe twice. For game jams, you want to provide an experience that is pretty much wrapped up in about 15 minutes. But Inscryption takes that 15-minute experience and figured out how to make it interesting for significantly longer. How do you go from battle to battle? What other tools and items can you use? Why are you there? The story for Sacrifices is, from what it sounds like, you and your child got into a bad car wreck and ended up in the cabin, starving and alone. Beat the creepy weirdo 3 times at his own card game and he says you'll get to eat. Only, spoiler alert, the only 2 choices on the menu are a starving man and a starving child. Either choice makes you end the game. Inscryption, although it has a very similar tone and atmosphere, has a very different story. If every run were about a starving person who wound up at the cabin for a different reason, it'd get kinda stale after 2 or 3 runs. Instead, without getting into specifics, it takes a much more meta turn. In each act, you're playing a different take on the same game. In Act 2, you get access to 3 new decks, each with a different playstyle. And in Act 3, everything gets a fresh metallic coat of paint and you go from 4 lanes to 5. But under the hood, it's still the same game. Sure, now you have energy and crystals and bones, but they aren't that different from the blood you used in Act 1. The core loop from Sacrifices Must Be Made is still there, robust as ever. It just looks different in a way to match the style of the current act. Hell, a lot of that may not have been needed to make an excellent game. Although the game did well critically, many critics weren't fans of the second half of the game. So a few months after the main release, an official extension to the first act came out called Casey's Mod, which doubled down and made that part of the game that much harder and more interesting to play, turning it into a proper roguelike with no definite end. The next big lesson I want to talk about is in regards to difficulty. Difficulty is a largely subjective experience. What may take one player 10 minutes to do might take a different one 10 hours. And game balance was actually a major sticking point when Mullins was making the game for this reason. In an interview with Game Rant, Mullins said, "I would have some people telling me they would beat the bad guy in the cabin in 20 hours, and it's amazing that they even persisted that long because it was so hard and they were so frustrated. Some people would tell me they'd breeze through it in 2 hours, so I had to try and find ways to modulate that so people who found it too easy would take a bit longer and get more roadblocks, and people who found it too hard can eventually overcome it. To that end, I think Inscryption's main story succeeds where many games fail. The first couple runs present fewer options, forcing the player to take specific, difficult routes. Even if the players are able to handle this difficulty normally, getting too far in the first few runs triggers an event in which Leshy says "too fast, too soon," and spawns 8 bears on his side of the playing field. This is an event which can be beat, but likely won't be unless the player plans for it specifically. After those first couple runs, however, more options present themselves and the roadblocks are removed. However, just getting to the end and beating the final boss isn't enough to get to the next chapter. Completing the puzzles in Leshy's cabin is critical to true progression in the game. Doing so unlocks a number of new cards and items that the player can use. Along with this, there's multiple forms of power creep that the player can experience. The most obvious is that each time a player loses a run, they get to create their own card which they can then find in future runs. But there's also cards like the Ouroboros which are permanently upgraded across every run each time it dies. This results in a gameplay loop that wants you to beat it, just not too quickly. And for the sake of the narrative, this actually works out perfectly. I personally beat all 3 acts in about 11 hours, and reading the reviews, this seems about average for most people. It gets the point across using the looping structure of a roguelike without being a major time sink that feels stale by the end like games such as Lobotomy Corporation. However, the narrative is one of those that can really only be experienced once, and playing through the first act too many times can throw the game wildly off balance due to the player's power creep. As mentioned, a couple months after the main game came out, an official extension to Act 1 was released called Casey's Mod. Casey's Mod cuts out the main game's narrative and rebalances everything to remove most of the player's long-term power creep. Instead, it gets a more typical meta progression seen in other indie roguelikes. Challenge modifiers, more variety in starting decks, and new events, cards, and items have all been added, giving that part of the game significantly more longevity for those who desire it. To some extent, this video was actually an excuse to go and try Casey's Mod myself, as I haven't touched the game since I beat the main story. And I can see why people find it enjoyable. You essentially need to relearn the entire game as a lot of the tricks you might have learned no longer work, and the power creep you're used to is no longer there. I think this is an excellent way to extend the replayability of the game while not compromising on the original experience, as you have to beat the game properly first in order to access it. The last lesson I want to talk about is a bit more about art and writing than the actual mechanics. If you're trying to make something spooky, be it a proper horror game or something just with a spooky tone, Ambiguity is your friend. Not knowing why you're in the cabin at first, both in Inscryption and Sacrifices Must Be Made, really make their respective stories pop. Playing into that is the combination of a dark environment and lower resolution graphics. Until fairly late into Act 1, you don't even know what Leshy looks like, and it's not until later parts of the game that you know what his motivation actually is. Once you're past the first act, a significant amount gets explained, but in a way that raises more questions than answers. You learn about other characters in the game, their allegiances and their motivations, but underpinning the whole thing is the ever-present question, why? And then you get into Act 3, which further clarifies some parts of what's happening, while still making the core mystery that much more mysterious. To delve into that would be outside the scope of this video, but there are plenty of other YouTubers who have talked about it before. What I want to focus on is why the intentional ambiguity here works. And it's simple. Enough is provided at any given point that the player can somewhat piece together what's happening, but enough is left out to keep everything uncertain and allow for expectations to be subverted in ways that aren't readily predictable. If you want to write a mystery or build tension for horror, keeping things ambiguous is an excellent way to keep the player's brain engaged. Early on, Inscryption feels like it's going to be a horror game. You're in a creepy man's cabin and he outright kills you if you don't beat his game. The anxiety of why he's doing this shrouds your first couple runs, but as more is revealed and as your death becomes normalized, it becomes more of a mystery than a horror game. Why are cards talking? What do I get for solving these puzzles? How do I break the cycle, and what does that mean? I think that's about as much as I can pull without really delving into it. Like most of the games I try to talk about, I fully encourage you to play this one yourself if you haven't already. Like I said, it's one of my personal favorites, and many people were calling it the best indie game of 2021. So before we go, let's recap what we've learned. First, when designing your gameplay loop, start extremely simple, but design in such a way that allows the game to be able to expand in scope. Sacrifices Must Be Made was a card game that revolved around sacrificing cards as a game mechanic, with very simple implementations of items and sigils. But Inscryption was able to expand on that base in terms of scope, polish, and story. Don't from the get-go try to make Halo on your own. It won't work. Trust me. Second, a difficult game doesn't mean a good game. Even if you have a solid gameplay loop, it can and will get stale after a long time. Sometimes it's best to subtly expedite the player for the sake of keeping the story well-paced. However, this is entirely dependent on what kind of game you're trying to make. This works well for Inscryption because even casual players can beat the game without much trouble. But for games in which player skill is a necessity, it'd likely be a detriment instead. In games with a high skill ceiling, you might want to implement a system of gatekeepers instead, as discussed in my video on Ultrakill. Just be warned that if you do go watch that, it was the first non-devlog I made, so the editing and sound mixing weren't as great as they are now. Third, many games can benefit from some level of ambiguity, especially those which revolve around mystery or horror. Genres which need to keep the player on their toes to stay interesting. A mystery in which you know everything isn't really a mystery. And horror with no sense of tension isn't really horror because having a jump scare every 30 seconds doesn't really give the player any catharsis. In fact, after the first couple jumps, it'd likely feel more annoying than anything. To aid in this, ambiguity should not just impact the writing, but the visuals and sound as well. If you see Leshy in the light, he looks more gross than scary, but shrouded in darkness where you can only see the glint in his eyes, his form becomes much more ominous. When all of this is layered together, you can craft a specific tone or mood for the player to feel as they play. If you've made it this far, I sincerely want to thank you for watching. The past few weeks have been great, and since the story generator video went out, the channel has grown over 10 times what it was in December. So with this video going out, I'm going to put out a poll. To get there, I'll have a link in the description, or you can go to my community tab. I want to know what kind of content you guys are interested in. At this point, I've put out a few different styles of video since the beginning of the new year, and the most well-received was the story generator video. But I'm not sure if that was simply a fluke of the YouTube algorithm, or if it's a genuine avenue for growth. The poll is going to ask which of the recent videos is your favorite, and then down in the comments I'd appreciate if you told me why. Some people have said they enjoy the storytelling aspect of some of these videos, others have said it's because I've talked about some of their favorite games, and some enjoy how I've been breaking down games or genres to explain what makes them impactful and enjoyable. Any feedback is good feedback. Right now I'm kind of throwing stuff at the wall to see what sticks. I'm going to let this poll run for about a week before making another proper video. But while it's running, I'm going to make a new channel trailer to reflect my current content and replace that announcement video that I've had up since Christmas. Expect that to go out on the 10th, and then on the 11th, I'll be joining Salford Sal on her Twitch stream. She reached out after hearing I was a fairly rusty Dwarf Fortress player and has been doing a series of streams to help both new and old players alike get back into the game. I hope you guys join us, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say. And I will see you next time.